Welcome to Friday night's video in our Master Series. This is the 35th video in our Master Series and the 5th video in our first phase processing. Tonight we're going to get into sound sculpting. First thing, keep in mind, this is going to probably be a few videos because it's a very important phase and there's a lot of subjects to cover and deal with it. The second thing I wanted to talk about is I keep my sound sculpting in a couple different phases. I do my first basic sound sculpting, then I add effects, and then I do equalization. But basically all these things combined are really a part of sound sculpting. Also sample fusion, synth fusion, and things like that are going to be incorporated into actual sound sculpting. But the most basic aspect of sound sculpting is a little bit more simple. And when we're talking about sound sculpting, the most basic tools you have are noise, you have saturation, you have even and odd harmonics, and even and odd harmonics, and non-harmonic distortion. And to give you an example of that is the voice is the most natural transducer and the most familiar transducer that you're aware of and familiar with. And if I get a fundamental frequency and choose one, I've got this fundamental frequency, and then I've got noise mixed in with it that the transducer is putting in there with it. I've got saturation, and I've got varying degrees of even and odd harmonics and sometimes non-harmonic distortion that actually makes my voice unique from someone else. So it's some of the most basic fundamental sound sculpting tools that you have. Now, you have to remember that when you're sound sculpting, basic sound sculpting, like I'm sound sculpting a voice or something to make it sound better, that most of the time these basic sound sculpting tools that I was just speaking of are used most of the time. But in more elaborate sound sculpting, I'll be doing effects work and equalization work and sometimes even reverberation work and things like that. And so I've got them pretty much in line just in case there's sometimes I got to bounce back and forth, because it's like I got to hear, I'm not sure if I want to do that because what's going to happen when I stick that delay on there or that when I EQ it like that, I'm not sure how it's going to sound. If I can't hear it in my head, I might jump around a little bit, and that's okay. Just keep that in mind. Also, filtering. You might want to go back and revisit that video, Master Series 18, doing high pass, low pass, and notch filtering, because sometimes you might do something to it when you're sound sculpting, and then you want to go ahead and do a little bit of filtering before you do something else. Like you might be adding noise, and then you might do a little bit of filtering in the upper end and the lower end, and maybe some notch filtering before you do some other harmonic work, adding harmonic content. That's okay, because that's just a part of sound sculpting. Can be very tedious, and and when you get good at it and you become a really good engineer with understanding what's happening there, things might not take you as long, but as you do it, that it's better to filter things out that you don't want before you add something else to it. And normally sound sculpting is one step at a time, adding other things to create a sound that you want. So let's go ahead and look at some of the most basic tools. The most basic tools we have when we're sound sculpting is noise is the first tool. And if you get online, you can get like blue, brown, gray, pink, violet, and white noise. Those are the basic ones I work with, and sometimes I will bounce some of them together and mix them a little bit to come out with some certain type of noise. Like brown noise is really soft, and pink noise is pretty harsh, and blue noise is pretty harsh. And sometimes a mixture of them can give you just the right texture you want, because it can really add texture to a sound. So basically, when you're looking at, if you've got like a test tone or something like that, and you've got a spectrogram, you can very easily see that, with that test tone, and you're adding noise into it. Now, with with a whole sound that was like a vocal or something like that, you would see all the harmonics that the noise was saturating. But I'm using a test tone to show you what happens when you saturate and cause harmonics. But normally, most of the time, I add noise in first, at varying degrees. I normally use actually a vent like that and get it to where I want it. Let's say that I've got a sound or a vocal across the track, like up here or something like that, and I'm going across it. I'll show you that in the next video. But I'll go through there, and then I will do automation work on that. I will bounce that onto this file and then bounce it onto the other file. So I'll show you a little bit about that in the next video. But it's one of the most fundamental tools you have. And once you understand what a huge tool it is, that you would be amazed how much noise can sculpt a sound. I mean, it is amazing. And you'll see on the next video, I'm going to do some work on some vocals so you can kind of see it being done on some kind of sound. But it is phenomenal what kind of power noise has to change a sound. Now, the next thing, there's lots of other tools that you can use to, like, to add even an odd harmonic, saturations, distortions, all kinds of things like that. And I've checked out quite a few of them. Now, you can have to pull out a spectrogram, get out a test tone generator, and figure out what's coming off of it. There's a calculation link on my channel, so you can go look at it and figure out, calculate what it's doing, even in odd harmonics and things like that. But that's going to take some investigation on your part to see whatever the heck is the plugin you got is doing. But I've got this Trash 2. It's my favorite one. Now, it wasn't designed by NASA, but it does some pretty cool stuff. And most of the time, the things that I talked about adding saturation, and I talked about adding odd harmonics, even in odd harmonics, and sometimes square clipping. Well, with this plugin, I figured out a way to cause those by themselves off of fundamental, which is phenomenal because those are the most basic things that cause a sound like my voice to sound like it does, and to enhance it or change it the way I want to. Does that make sense? So, you see noise going across the spectrum, and if you look at like saturation, if I go in here and I chose full spectrum saturation, you can see the difference of it. If I turn it on, it's real obvious what the difference is of it. If you look at it, saturation is more musical because you can see looking across the spectrum that there's separation there, even in odd harmonics, all kinds of harmonic content that's not nowhere near as dense as noise. And it's huge for sound sculpting because on a tool like this, you can add it in for various degrees of whatever sound you're working on with your wet and dry mix to how much you want to add full spectrum harmonics. And then filter out this stuff down here. This is intermodulation distortion coming off, bouncing back from up here to the lower end. You want to filter that out with an EQ. And we had talked about that, maybe doing some filtering at each stage as you add things. And that's huge. Also, that it will add, I can add like square clipping distortion, and it's pretty obvious what's that. You can see what's going on there. You can see the kind of distortion. I mean, it's some pretty harsh clipping distortion across there, mostly odd harmonics, but you can see that it gets pretty dirty in between those odd harmonics. And after that, I mean, I also can add, I got even and odd harmonics. You can look here and see that these are even and odd harmonics. You can see I've got one of them, the odd harmonics, at a lower decibel level, so you can see the difference between the even and odd harmonics, and it'll add them all the way across the spectrum. And we talked about even and odd harmonics before, and the uses of them then, and what is what they are normally used to be caused from, and what as far as analog equipment and things like that. But they're also just inherent in sound. So you got even and odd harmonics, just even harmonics. You can see that drop off. Those ones all drop off, and it's dropping those off and going straight to just even harmonics across the spectrum that I can add in at various degrees, or odd harmonics. And odd harmonics, all these odd harmonics, they say, are more musical, but normally like a violin is basically even in odd harmonics. That's what gives it its really smooth sound. So you've got great tools there for sound sculpting and blending them into each whatever sound you're working on in various degrees. And with this tool, you can warp the crap out the sound also. I mean, when I talk about, non-harmonic distortion and just noise, this thing can warp some sounds. There's no doubt about it. So you can fuss around it in sound sculpting, and this thing can also make, trash some noise. There's no doubt about it. If you want to trash some noise, this thing will do it. So it's a great tool. It's one of the best tools that I could find that, was engineered for, music, but wasn't made by NASA. Does that make sense? Because I have MATLAB equipment that'll do that kind of stuff, but it's not like a plugin like that. It makes it kind of hard to throw things in MATLAB all the time. So those are your biggest tools to really do some serious sound sculpting. And with those tools, that it is amazing as you take some type of sound and you add noise into it first, start bringing noise into it. Now, you may or may not render that noise on there immediately, because you might jump back and forth, because I'll normally put a chain on there that's got a noise file on some other track that I'm eventually going to bounce onto that track later, and then I'll put those in like my isotope in series, to where so I can add like full spectrum, full spectrum saturation, even harmonics, odd harmonics, and some even and odd harmonics, and maybe another one that adds clipping distortion, to start bringing them into it and seeing what it's doing to the sound. See whatever looping area, and whether it's a vocal or a synth or a guitar or whatever, and start seeing how it's affecting the sound, and backing up, bringing in some other different ones and things like that. It's phenomenal that these are your most basic tools and the most basic building blocks of sound sculpting that can do phenomenal work on the sound that you're working on. So I'm not getting into really wild stuff like effects, a phaser effect or some type of other modulation, ring modulator or some other thing. Those are different kind of things that we add into sound sculpting after we've sculpted the sound here to where it sounds as good as possible. And then later, if I want to add a phaser to it or some other weird effect that's part of sound sculpting, like equalization, or put samples on top of it and bounce samples onto it and things like that we'll talk about also. This is your most basic tools. And if you're going to be an engineer and you're going to work with sound at all, I suggest you buying this product. It's trash too, so I hate to be trying to pump somebody, but these guys, in my opinion, did a pretty good job on this. It took a little while to figure out how to do what I'm doing with it, but once I got it to where I could get it off the fundamental and could see what was happening, it actually did a pretty good job of it. It wasn't built by NASA, but it's doing a pretty good job. And anything that's causing audio artifacts, I found that I can just filter out. If it causes some stuff in the upper end or the lower end or something like that, because it's not that clean of a filter or an algorithm, that I could filter it out easily and it was causing no issues. So I highly recommend this, because those are some of the biggest tools you have. And you'll see when I start talking about sculpting a vocal or something in the next video, how much I can take a vocal. I've got a vocalist that's singing da 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 da, and it's like, well, he doesn't sound too bad, but doesn't sound that good. With those tools, I can make him sound bad ass. I can adjust the even harmonics in his voice, the odd harmonics, the saturation. I can adjust the noise in his harmonics. I can actually tweak his actual transducer to and sculpt it. Does that make sense? They're phenomenal tools to where you can make a vocalist just sound awesome. That was not exactly the best vocalist in the world, or you can take a really good vocalist and just make their stuff just sound like just cream, bro. Does that make sense? And just make it sound really sweet. So they're huge tools, and I definitely recommend this, and I definitely recommend you downloading some noise files and experiment around with what I'm talking about. And it is just a huge experimentation of you using them one after another. Normally I go noise, then I go full spectrum saturation, and then I start fussing around with a little bit of like clipping distortion, and maybe not, I'll back off. Now I'm not ready for that. I'll do even harmonics, see what that's doing, odd harmonics, do what that's doing, and see what's happening there. And then maybe I might add some clipping distortion. It might add a little bit of harshness, because you would think that clipping distortion is harsh, but with it being added with noise and full spectrum saturation, it's not always going to come out harsh. So it's something you got to keep in mind, and it's an experimentation in itself, that once you start to see what it does to it, and you're looking at the spectrogram and the scope and listening to it, it's amazing that what kind of fine detailed work of editing a sound you can do with those tools. Does that make sense? And there's another tool that I have that is called Sigmod that you should check out, about splitting frequencies and splitting channels and things like that, and to try to separate a sound from the fundamental. There's a tool that I have in my DAW that you can actually separate the fundamental from the rest of the frequencies, so you can work on them separately. So if you got any tools that can do that, then I highly recommend it, because in my DAW, that it's this tool here, and actually I'm trying to figure out where it went. This tool here, and it does it well. I'll show it to you in the next video. So anyway, investigate those tools and check that out. I'll see you in the next video when we fuss with some vocals. Peace, hope, love. I hope you enjoyed the video. See you in the next one.